webinar. And my name is Davetta Thatcher. It's my alias is Ask Questions Here, because we're going to ask you to direct your questions to me, and then I will give them to the speakers when we get to the end session of Q&A. I'm also the vice president of the chapter. So we have one more meeting before the new year comes, and that is in November. And then we have a program from January through through May of next year. So we're excited that you're here with us today. This session, by the nature of it being a policy session and not a strict engineering session, does not have CEUs. So there will be no survey and questions for you to fill out for CEUs. I want to start by introducing Sissy Bai, who is our chapter's liaison to a subgroup at AEE called CWheel. And I'll even let Sissy tell you what that stands for. Sissy?
Sure, thank you, Davetta. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sissy Bai, and just fall into Davetta's note, CWheel stands for Council on Women in Energy and Environment Leadership. It is the women division under the national AEE, and we basically provide a network for women in the energy and environmental industries. And our mission is to support career development for professional women through mentoring, networking, and scholarship programs. So today, I just have three quick announcements about the organization. So as we all experienced, this year has many changes going on. For CWheel, we have proposed two changes on the organization structure. First, we propose to add a CWheel lead position to local CWheel chapter boards. So there will be at most 2 women representing CWheel in local chapters. And the second, we propose to create local CWheel groups within AEE local chapters. In that sense, we can recruit and engage more women in the local chapters. So we expect the national AEE approves this new structure in a few days. And if you're interested in CWheel or the member benefits, please direct message me during this meeting. And the second announcement I have is we are recruiting mentors for our mentoring programs. Mentors could be either male or female. Currently, there are 3 mentees waiting to be paired up. So if you or anyone who have some free time and love to help emerging professionals in this industries, please direct message me as well. And the last announcement I have is about AEE World Conference. This year, CWheel will host 2 virtual networking events on December 3rd and December 4th. So you've already registered or plan to join the conference during December 1st to 4th, and we'd love to see you at the networking events. And we will announce the CWheel Champion Awards during the second events. And the sign note I have to our New York City chapter is the deadline for Champion Chapter Award nominations is in 6 days. So, and winning chapter will receive $500 award. So that's all I have. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely, Sissy, thank you very much. And that's a reminder to everyone that you should start seeing emails from AEE National, if you are a national member, to register for the World Conference, which is the first week of December, and I certainly encourage all of you to do so. We have a wonderful program for you today, and I'm going to turn it over to Phyllis Kessler, who will introduce our speakers. Phyllis?
Thank you, Davetta. This afternoon, we're going to have a program on environmental justice, which is a very timely topic these days. And we have 2 speakers for the program, Raya Salter and Mike Harrington. Both come from slightly different perspectives to this topic. But I'm going to introduce Raya, who's going to speak first, and then Mike will speak after she does. Raya is an attorney, educator, and a clean energy law and policy expert with a focus on energy and on climate justice. And she's a member of the New York State Climate Action Council, which is developing the New York State plan under the New York State law that was passed a year ago in July. And the intention is to reach the nation's leading climate action goals. She's also the policy director for the New York Renews Climate Justice Coalition. In her previous role, she was senior attorney at the National Resources Defense Council and at the Environmental Defense Fund, where I actually met Raya because I was working on a matter with the Environmental Defense Fund, and Raya was the attorney for the organization who I worked directly with. Raya has practiced in several jurisdictions, which include New York, California, and Hawaii. And she's an adjunct professor at Fordham Law School. And she's also the co-editor of a book entitled Energy Justice, U.S. and International Perspectives. Raya sits on the board of directors of the Energy and Environmental Study Institute and is also on the advisory board of Evergreen Action. So I'm pleased to introduce Raya and to have her go ahead and give us her talk.
Thank you so very much for that, Phyllis. Thank you for this invitation. It's always wonderful to see you. Thank you to, that was fantastic, to Sissy and Seawill. What an amazing slate of activities that are going on there. Thank you to my host. Thank you to my co-speaker, Mike, who you'll hear from later. I was particularly interested in speaking to this group. Actually, let me share my screen. This is the one place where you gotta hold on and hope things go okay with Raya. Technology. Oh, wait, okay, don't worry. We're gonna get there with the screen share. Can everyone see my screen? Oh, huzzah! Okay, excellent. So yes, I was particularly interested in talking to this group because I love talking to folks about the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. It is ambitious. It has significant, it is, I think, going to spur a lot of change. It is the only law in the country that has this type of equity and justice, these types of equity and justice provisions. And I'm particularly excited for this group of folks, the engineers and affiliated, because I truly believe that without this cohort, the objectives of this law cannot be met. So I'm excited to talk to you about the law, about what we're trying to do, the ambition, and hopefully we can inspire folks to get engaged and excited about climate action in New York State. All right, so Phyllis, I was saying to myself, Raya, send a shorter bio next time. Phyllis gave the whole bio, so I won't belabor this slide. But yes, I have a diverse background as a clean energy advocate who does focus on energy and climate justice. So I wanted to spend just some time really focusing on, we'll talk about the goals and about the law more broadly, but I'm going to focus on those just environmental and climate justice concerns. This is what you came for. And so I like to ground the conversation in advocacy terms and concepts. So New York Renews, which really drove the passage of the law, and particularly the energy and justice provisions, really came out of the climate march. And I always, when I talk about this, I like to say, go ahead and put your hands up. I bet there are folks on this call who were at that march. Go ahead and raise your hand or put it in the chat if you were. I know that I was there. And the groundswell of support for climate action is really what drove the passage of these provisions. And I'd like to talk about the way that these concepts really kind of emerged from the movement before I go ahead and talk about the law itself. So, and I like to start that with just a basic grounding of a good definition or a way to get your arms around environmental justice. So we're embracing the principle that all people and communities have a right to equal protection and equal enforcement of environmental laws and regulations. The lawyers out there may recognize this from, civil rights law, from our Constitution. And another piece that's very important to environmental justice is that we need to have a equitable distribution of both environmental benefits and harms. And critically, that includes cumulative impacts over time. I would be remiss if I didn't, the folks on this call may or may not have know of We Act for Environmental Justice. Cecil Corbin Mark, who was a longtime EJ champion and pioneer for 26 years, unexpectedly and suddenly passed last week, which is just a real blow to the environmental movement, to the environmental justice movement. And and apologies for anyone who's hearing this for the first time, but I just wanted to take a moment to honor and acknowledge Cecil and his groundbreaking work in this area of environmental justice. So when we move past environmental justice and into climate justice, there's two things I want to talk about. One is what really I call the climate justice principle, which is that those who have done the most to contribute to climate change, climate crisis, greenhouse gas emissions in particular, but also the coinciding environmental degradation. Those who have done the most are suffering those impacts the least, and those who have done the least to contribute to climate crisis are and will continue to experience its most devastating impacts first. And so that implies that, or implicates the idea that those who have contributed most have an elevated responsibility to address the root causes and to do what is needed to prevent climate crisis and make sure that those who are most impacted are also able to survive and thrive. Now, this is important on a global scale, as you may have heard climate justice say in the context of the 2015 Paris talks, where countries like small island nations, the countries in the global south are saying, look, we've done the least and we're getting impacted the most. And it also is something on that local level that is important to think about in terms of, particularly in the United States, low-income communities, communities of color, and in particular, children are most impacted by climate first and worst. I'd like to also say that it's important to note that climate justice is a concept that also arose out of environmental justice, both on that local and international frame. So now we'll touch very briefly on energy justice. So this is something that's much newer as a concept. I co-edited a book called Energy Justice. I'd say probably within the past 10 years or so, it's been talked about in the academy. And it really is looking at how can we focus these justice and equity concepts, climate justice, human rights, environmental justice onto energy law and policy in particular. And my book and books that have come before have really grappled of it in terms of kind of grouping of principles, because it's so big, right? Energy is so unitary, and sustainability are so unitary. So the ideas are that we want to develop energy and energy systems with due process, including transparency, accountability, and responsibility. Energy must be affordable, sustainable, available, and it must be fair and equitable among and for generations over time. So that intergenerational justice piece is also a key climate justice imperative. So in this presentation, we blew by that, but there will be some links that I provided, and I think they're going to get sent around. So you'll be able to peruse those links that just give some more information, WEACT's website, more info on EJ and climate justice. So let's go ahead and jump into the CLCPA, what is going on in New York State? And here there's a picture again, just grounding it in movements and folks who've really pushed for this. This is the New Yorker News rally last year in June. I was there, not as a employee of New Yorker News, but as a, I like to tell this story, you know, they call you up as a lawyer and they're like, we need a legal observer for our direct action where we're all going to get arrested. And you're like, oh, okay, I'll come and provide direct action support. I am not your attorney for this matter, but I will come and provide support. And then over 60 activists show up with your personal cell phone number written on their arms or their tummies in Sharpie, ready to call you when they hit the pen. I joke, it turns out that day, I don't joke, that happened, but that was what was going to happen. No one ended up getting arrested that day because frankly, the police said, we don't have the time and resources to arrest you climate activists today. And we ended up politely picking up all of our trash, properly disposing it and getting on the bus home. Just a little story, but it was a big deal and a big day. What happened? The CLCPA, it really is a big deal. There's no state in the nation that's looking to get to 100% net zero economy-wide, not only the energy sector by 2050. And we'll go ahead and talk about some of these justice provisions. Let me just do a time check because I like to keep my remarks short. Wow, what are we talking about in terms of the CLCPA? We are talking about, yes, this economy-wide reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. We are talking about carbon-free electricity by 2040, 70% by 2030. This is a bump up from the administrative clean energy goals that New York State already had. Big goals for offshore wind, storage, solar, massive goals for energy efficiency, and particular attention to this mandate that we've all been hearing for many years about electrification, right? We need to electrify everything if we're going to go forward in this clean energy future. Sorry, I should have turned my phone off. Telemarketer. So how did these concepts that I talked to you about before, climate and environmental justice, show up in the law itself? Guess what they do? One of the big pieces in this law is what we call the investment mandate. And that is a goal that 40% of state spending on climate must go to the benefit of disadvantaged communities, and no less than 35%. So this is a redirect and reinvestment frame. Disadvantaged communities, there are some preliminary criteria in the law, and how these communities will be identified is through the Climate Justice Working Group, and we'll talk a little bit more about that process. So the law builds in a way to refine who these communities are. But this is climate justice, right? How is this climate justice? In many ways, but one, we need to take the resources that are being spent on fighting climate change and shift them to make sure that those who are experiencing those impacts most, first, and worst, but did the least to contribute to them, are receiving those resources. Climate justice. Oop, let me go back. Environmental justice. What does the CLCPA say? State contracts and decisions, permits approvals must not disproportionately burden disadvantaged communities. We must prioritize emissions reductions in disadvantaged communities, and also create an air monitoring program so we can start getting a baseline for how our air quality is in general, but in particular for disadvantaged communities. I hope that this rings a bell from the environmental justice definition, right? Disproportionate burden, these burdens that we want to examine. That is directly from climate justice, as is focusing prioritization of reducing emissions in disadvantaged communities, alleviating the health and other problems that these pollutants cause. Environmental justice. energy justice. And the point I'm going to pick out is the process. So the law created the Climate Action Council. It is made up of state agency heads and also a minority of appointees, of which I am one. And it creates both a just transition working group and a climate justice working group. Now, in particular, the Climate Justice Working Group has a very important role. This is the body that I alluded before. We'll be refining that metric of who is supposed to get the funds in this redirect frame. The update is that this process is very much underway. There are over 90 stakeholders who've been impaneled. There's a panel on energy efficiency. There's a panel on power generation. I encourage folks, and in the materials after this call, there's a link. You can go, you can sign up to get updates from NYSERDA, updates from the DEC. You can see where the meetings are. You can join them virtually. I pretty much promise you that if you work and practice in New York, you're going to see somebody on this list of panels and panelists that you know. And I encourage you to get in touch, get engaged in the process. This is one piece that goes back to energy justice, participatory processes that we are also hoping and working to make transparent. And that brings me to the end. Please feel free to email me. You can go to my website. Oh, this particular slide has an error. And you can also see me on Instagram. So that is it for now. I will yield the floor to my illustrious co-speaker. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Go ahead, Phyllis.
Yeah, and this is a really great lead-in for the talk that Mike Harrington is going to give. So I want to give a little bit of an introduction to Mike. Mike is at the New School, and he's responsible for supporting the work of the Tishman Center at the New School. By acting as a liaison with offices and departments throughout the university, and in implementing projects that advance the New School's commitment to sustainability and to environmental justice. He also was a fellow in the 2019-2020 Urban Design Forum's Forefront Fellowship. And when he was there, he worked with a team of designers, policymakers, and planners to create solutions to urban heat deaths for the New York City Mayor's Office of Resiliency. Before joining that team, he worked at Elevate Energy, organizing around creating equity in the energy efficiency marketplace, and served as an associate board chair of another environmental nonprofit, the Delta Institute. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Mike, and we look forward to hearing.
All right. Thanks for that intro, and thanks, Raya, for sharing all that really useful information about EJ in New York. And I'll start sharing my screen as well. Please excuse all the tabs. Let's see. So yes, as Phyllis mentioned, I work at the New School at the Tishman Environment and Design Center. And we also work with a lot of external groups as well. In fact, we're part of the New York Renews Coalition as well. And thank you for mentioning Cecil at WEAC, because he's another he was a giant in the movement, and he was also WEAC is also a partner of ours that we work with quite often, along with a lot of other EJ groups, not only in the New York area, but also in basically across the country. I just wanted to make a note in terms of policy at the New School. One of my colleagues, Ana Baptista, just worked with a bunch of people just across the Hudson River in New Jersey in helping pass a cumulative impacts bill. I believe it's SB 232. that basically says that, make sure I get this right, it will deny permits to any industries that will basically put more of an environmental burden on communities that already have it. So it's a really, really pivotal bill in terms of environmental justice protection in the country. And I'm really glad to see, like in New York, we're also working on addressing those issues as well. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the work I did with the Urban Design Forum over the past year. We're looking at the problem of urban heat, environmental justice, and some of the ties to COVID-19 that exist. So here's a quick agenda of what I'm going to talk about. And yeah, if you all have any questions, you can put it in the chat, and hopefully I can answer them when we get to that time. But basically, my work at the Tishman Center, we ground everything at the Tishman Center in environmental justice. And we work both within the school and externally. So we just had a bunch of programming for Climate Week that's on our site. So if you go to our website, which is tishmancenter.org, you can see some of those talks. We talked a little bit about environmental justice in New York City. We talked about passing a green amendment. So basically that's something that's moving through the state legislature now, basically amending the state constitution to give protections for clean air, water, etc. And we also had a thing about mapping. So I can put a link in later if anyone's interested in that. And we also work in accordance with the Hermes principles, which is very, very important for our work, because we don't seek out work. We don't go to groups, environmental justice groups, and say like, hey, we're researchers, let us help you. We let them come to us and we work with them on really getting to what they want help with. So there's groups all across the country, like El Vejo in Chicago. We work with We Act. We work with El Puente in Williamsburg. We work with Seed out in Minnesota. So we work with a lot of different groups on advancing environmental justice through research and advocacy. And this leads me to my next point. As part of my work, I joined the Urban Design Forum's Forefront Fellowship. And it was very timely and relevant for us because the topic for last year's cohort was environmental justice. And specifically, they wanted to look at heat vulnerable neighborhoods and urban heat. And I'll explain what urban heat is, but this is actually something of a personal thing to me as well, because to give you an idea of how deadly urban heat it is the number one, basically by number of deaths, the number one killer of people in the United States. About 700 or so people die a year from urban heat. And I'm from Chicago, and in 1995, I don't know if any of you all remember this, there was a heat wave in that city. And in 2 weeks, like less than 2 weeks, about 10 days, about 700 to 800 people died from urban heat. So that's, like I said, that's how many people usually die in a year. And that's like the number one death from environmental disaster. So I was a little kid when it happened, but I do remember how terrible that was for people in my neighborhood. And when I saw the opportunity to work on something like this, I sort of jumped at it because it's super relevant. So for the Urban Design Forum Fellowship, there was about 25 of us that all have a lot of various backgrounds: engineering, design, architecture, policy, etc. And part of our methodology was conducting expert interviews for people at every level. So we made sure to talk to people in the community because we really wanted to understand the community experience of urban heat all across New York City. And we focused on the equitable impacts of extreme heat on Blacks and Latinos, because one of the biggest predictors for dying from urban heat is your race. Black people are much more likely to die from urban heat. So if you add in like race and age, like the people that die the most from urban heat are older Black men. So it's also a social issue, and I'll get into that. But we ended up developing a lot of recommendations. I want to say it was over 200 pages of them, but we pared it down to about 30 recommendations that you can read, and I'm happy to share it. And those recommendations went straight to the Mayor's Office of Resiliency because we wanted to give them some recommendations that could be implemented within a year. So they look at short, medium, and long-term solutions, but that's just a quick synopsis. So what is the urban heat island effect, you may ask? So for some of you who have been in both rural and urban areas, you may notice in the summertime, it tends to be hotter in the cities. And that air temperature can be between 1.8 to 5.4 degrees of Fahrenheit degrees higher than rural areas. And that's basically because in cities, we have a lot of paved surfaces and a lot of dark surfaces. And dark surfaces, I'm sure, as you all being engineers will know, will absorb more heat. And the urban heat island effect is not something that only happens in the summer. It actually happens all year round. And then sometimes it's even more pronounced in the wintertime. But in the summertime, it just happens to be more deadly because it's like the city has a dome of heat that basically traps that heat in there. And for a lot of people that don't have air conditioning or that live alone in very small apartments, it can be stifling. I'm sure all of us know what it's like to be in New York and deal with like summertime heat. So basically, it's just that cities are hotter than the areas that surround them because of the density, because of the dark paved surfaces, and many other things. So what we looked at is how to basically ameliorate the urban heat island effect for the most vulnerable populations. And like many environmental justice impacts, unfortunately, the urban heat island effect tends to affect people in marginalized communities even more. So we looked at the city's heat vulnerability index that basically maps risks of urban heat at neighborhood levels, and you can look this up. This is public information. And we also, since this report was actually released in April, a lot of my colleagues and I looked at how this will overlap with COVID, because in a lot of communities of color that are basically in a way restricted to where they live because of redlining and historical, legal, and basically procedural things that have happened in the country, people can't really move from where they are. And that's mostly like Black and Latino people that we looked at. So in those neighborhoods, they tend to have poorer air quality. Tend to have less medical resources. There tend to be higher rates of asthma, obesity, and other comorbidities that lead to more heat deaths. And this actually, if you're thinking about this, these are all respiratory and circulatory things. Those actually make people more vulnerable to deaths from COVID as well. So I believe in the United States, the last thing I looked at, I believe was data from Medicare. They were showing that Black people were about 3.3 times more likely to die from COVID, and Latino people were about 3.2. So it's really high, and this pretty much lines up with what we saw when we were looking at the heat deaths. But for heat deaths specifically, from about 2000 to 2012, half of the heat deaths in New York were non-Hispanic Black people. And that's pretty alarming because non-Hispanic Black people, basically, that's only about 23 to 25% of the population. So it's way oversized. So this is why the city basically reached out to us. And this is why this is an environmental justice issue, because it's affecting a marginalized group at a much higher rate. So some of the current city initiatives that we had for the summer to deal with urban heat, and these are more short-term solutions that the city suggested, was to distribute the air conditioning units to vulnerable populations. When I last looked into it, I know it was going pretty well with the distribution. I don't know, honestly, if they were able to get all of them out, but I know that was their plan, which is in the short term a good plan, because in some ways, because you will keep people alive. However, I think we need to look at the medium and long term, because you have to think about, well, we're introducing 74,000 air conditioning units into a city and that's going to raise the energy burden, like what Raya talked about. There's a lot of people that may not be able to afford those air conditioning units. And then the air conditioning units can actually exacerbate the heat island effect. So we have to take that into account as well. But in line with that, the city also provided financial assistance for some of those costs, because we found in our studies that a lot of people would actually succumb to the heat, and they would have air conditioners, but they wouldn't be able to afford to use them. So that's a huge equity issue when you only probably need an hour of air conditioning a day to stave off like some of the worst effects. But some people are in such dire straits, they literally couldn't afford that. And then the city also had outdoor misting, hydrants, spacious cooling centers to encourage social distancing, because again, this is a vulnerable population, and they're more, like I said, they're more likely to get COVID and to pass from it. So it's good that the city took these measures and encouraged this, but hopefully they can, and we're happy to work with them again on this. Hopefully they can look at ways to make this a more medium and long-term, make more medium and long-term solutions to deal with the issue. So next, so now I'm going to talk about some of the recommendations that we have in the report. This is only a snapshot of them. We had, like I said, we had 30 of them, and if anyone wants to read the report and send me questions about them, I'm happy to do so. But one of the things we looked at, and this is more of a physical change, is to install shade structures on buildings. So basically something like an awning, but an awning that you should be able to like lift or lower yourself. Because right now, look, the building code has some restrictions in it. So we also wanted to update the building codes so that we can enable optimal exterior shading, and then have like movable or permanent shading on the NYCHA campuses, because there's many of the vulnerable populations do live in NYCHA. We also had a lot of stuff about communications. So one of them is naming heat wave events. So we all know how hurricanes are named, and that sort of, it makes people able to understand not the urgency. And I don't want to say they can relate with the hurricane, because that's ridiculous, but like you sort of can put a name to something. You could say, okay, hurricane, blah, blah, blah. Let's look at that. And it's easy for people to articulate what's going on. So one of our suggestions was actually to do that, having a clear public message from an emergency agency that like, this is an emergency, because heat is invisible. Like you can tell when it's cold, you can literally see when your breath is freezing, when it's coming out your mouth, or when it's hot, you can't really see much. So it's sort of an invisible killer. And we said this is something that can make people acknowledge that this isn't a serious thing that's happening. So we could have a protocol for naming heat wave events in New York City, and then also use that to give people directions. And it leads into the next one: manage heat wave communications as emergency alerts. So like to literally give people, like when we deal with hurricanes, like Hurricane Delta's coming, you need to make sure that you're battening down the hatches. You may keep away from windows, et cetera, et cetera. The same thing and same logic applies for heat waves. Like, okay, heat wave Eric is coming. Let's make sure you have water. Make sure you have a place where you can get to air conditioning. Check on your neighbors. Make sure they're okay, especially your elderly neighbors. So we think communications can go a long, long way in actually helping stem some of those deaths. And we also think that the city can use a lot of their communications infrastructure that they already have, like the Link NYCs that we see all over the place in the city. They already have a lot of information on there. And I think over the summer they did have heat warnings. So I don't know if that's new, if that's because of what we mentioned, but I did notice that. But I think sending text alerts like they do for COVID now, having apps and having stuff that really is able to reach people that are in marginalized communities that may not have access to technology. So sending a simple text message alert to people that may not have smartphones is something that we recommended. And also talking about this stuff on the evening news is really helpful as well, because we found that a lot of people that are susceptible to this, older people tend to get a lot of their information from news, from like local news, instead of like looking on the internet, looking at Twitter, looking at Instagram, all that. They're not doing that. They're looking at the news and hearing from people in their communities. So those are some of the recommendations for communications. Obviously, we have a lot more. And this is another physical thing, looking at building retrofits. So this is sort of what I used to do a lot in my former life at Elevate Energy. We worked with mostly residential buildings. And energy efficiency is a low-hanging fruit, and it should be made easier to do because the return on investment of it is huge. So this recommendation goes along with upgrading and insulating building envelopes. And that's like insulating and air sealing. You have to do both. You can't just if you're just doing insulation with no air sealing, it's pretty useless. Not useless, but like it doesn't really solve the problem because you're just going to have air moving through. So upgrading and insulating building envelopes, which some people may think, okay, that's something for the winter time, but insulation actually does make a difference year round. Where in the winter, it keeps the cold out and keeps your heat in, it does the opposite in the summer. It basically slows the rate that your building will heat up. So the most deadly time of a heat wave is not the first day or the second day. It's like the few days afterwards, like 3 or 4 days afterwards. So if the building doesn't heat up as much and we can get to the end of that heat wave when it starts cooling down, that can make a big difference for people. And we also wanted to allow some variance in building codes for interior insulation, just to make it as easy to implement. It's easy to implement. And that's, I believe, local law 87. So that like multi-family buildings under 50,000 square feet, they can do like energy efficiency on those buildings. And we also wanted to make that like fair to the tenants as well. We also had a provision that like you can't just, you shouldn't raise rent on people when you're doing these upgrades. And we also want to make sure that these upgrades provide healthy environments, because again, if you're doing air sealing and insulation, you're basically tightening that building. And if there's already, if you have poor building stock, which is very common in these areas where we have marginalized people, there may be issues like mold or other issues that make it hard for people to breathe and lead to higher incidents of getting sick or being hospitalized. So making sure that when you say like we're going to do these retrofits, making sure that you check the building for health issues as well, so that people are not being sealed in an unhealthy building. And those are a few of the building ones. And then again, these are some of our policy recommendations, and I'm almost done, and we can get to the questions soon. But I believe that we have like a minimum allowable indoor temperature in the city. One of our policy recommendations was to have a maximum allowable indoor temperature in the summer. And that's just for the same reason that we have that in the winter, just to make sure that people are in a safe and a healthy environment. And that maximum indoor temperature should only be about 90 degrees. Some would say 88. It honestly doesn't take that much to succumb from urban heat or from heat in general, especially if you have any sort of illness or weakened immune system. Like 4 or 5 days at like 90 degrees can be really deadly for some people. Again, allowing the variances for interior building insulation. Looking at zoning ordinances and specifying shading requirements, because if you walk around the city, you'll see some places have basically no trees, nothing shading them, and sunlight's just hitting that building all day, heating up that building, heating up the windows, basically creating like an oven-like atmosphere. So like looking at ways to deal with that would be a big help. And then also green infrastructure. Like trees and green infrastructure are very, very important in dealing with urban heat. I know in my neighborhood, we don't have a ton of trees, but then I go to some neighborhoods, there's like trees everywhere, and green, and like that the trees actually do cool down your neighborhood. If you look at places that have like a lot of green infrastructure, as opposed to others that don't, and I'm talking about not just trees, but like green infrastructure in general, you tend to see lower temperatures. So these are just a few of the recommendations we came up to deal with urban heat. And if you are dealing with these issues, it will also deal with issues like respiratory diseases like COVID-19 that we have. And because like all of these things are basically interrelated is what I'm saying. They're not just like, you can't just like separate them. And most environmental justice issues are like that. So at the Tishman Center, we look at things in the big picture and we try to figure out solutions, not to just one problem, but like many problems at all. And that's basically all I have for today. So yeah, I'll be looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mike. I'm going to start us off and ask a question to Raya first, and then which is, what are some of the challenges to implementing policies and design solutions like the ones that I'm sorry, that's Mike's question. So let me ask that to Mike first. What are some of the challenges to implementing policy and design solutions like some of the ones that you mentioned?
I know some of them, I think for a lot of them, it's money and capacity, because I know like one of the reasons we were brought in to work with this is because the Mayor's Office of Resiliency was like, okay, we need more capacity to come up with solutions. And that's unfortunately usually because of money and like hiring staff. So I would say like that's one of the biggest ones, and that's one of the biggest ones I saw when I worked at Elevate Energy on these sorts of issues. And also getting some political buy-in was tricky for certain things, because when you're wanting to change policy, you have to, we always believed in making it more community-based. And sometimes that can take a while when you have to reach out to all these stakeholders. But I believe that's the right thing to do, that you should actually talk to the people that your policies are affecting to make sure that it is what they would like, and it is done with their consent, and it empowers them in as much as possible.
Great, thank you. Raya, what are some of the critical environmental and climate justice issues that you think are at the top of the concerns in New York State right now?
So thank you so much for that question. I would say that it's important really to emphasize and note that we are in a financial crisis. We are in the depths of a public health crisis. And we also understand or we've come to understand a lot more about the overlapping impacts that those economic, COVID, being close to sources of pollution, how those have overlapped to just exacerbate the impacts in particular on low-income communities and communities, Black and Brown communities of color in New York. So we know that is happening. We know that, and this I think is emblematic or symptomatic or a preview of how we're going to continue to experience these things more and more as the impacts of climate catastrophe, descend upon us. Difficult. So of course we need revenue. We need a recovery. We need a just recovery. So that is certainly, I think, really the backdrop of what's happening for all of us here. And I do think that implementing things like what I had spoken to, that investment mandate or that redirect of funds of the 35 and 40% to disadvantaged communities, and planning for doing it now and planning for that going forward, is one of the important parts of that solution, as is in the advocacy I do with New Yorker News, working to implement some of these other justice and equity provisions. So as we move forward with our clean energy goals, we are not doubling down on the negative impacts that have historically happened for environmental and climate justice communities. So that would be a short answer. Sorry to bring in all the dooms and glooms.
Well, I think that's very helpful. And it occurs to me, and I'm just going to ask one follow-up question about this, that how do you think that this is going to impact the economy within the state overall?
Meaning the CLCPA in particular, or just the?
Yes, and what you just talked about.
We're in, and I'm sure, but everyone on this call, I mean, this is something we all have to grapple with and think about every day. We're in a tough spot. You know, we're waiting and hoping, hopefully not in vain, that we'll get some federal assistance. We're hoping that we'll see some revenue generation plans in New York State. New Yorker News has a what we call a carbon penalty, a pricing mechanism, a bill that we're advancing that we think would raise some revenue and help pay for some of these programs. And, you know, again, well, let's just say that I am a fan of a Green New Deal. So I'll stop. I'm going on a rail there. I'll stop.
I'm going to ask Devetta if there are questions from any of the participants. Otherwise, I have some additional questions.
Yes, we do have a couple. One of them is with regard to the study that NIPA is undertaking to replace the peaker plants with storage. If that goes through, and Raya, this probably is a question that you can answer. If that goes through, do you think that will count towards meeting the climate justice 35 to 40% total, replacing the peaker plants with storage?
So, I mean, in my mind, the prioritization of emissions reductions, disadvantaged communities is what's at the heart there. To the extent that there is spending that is done on behalf of climate, and that could be if there's a state investment in storage, then yes, I would say that investment, this is my, you know, that investment mandate is implicated. And yes, I'm familiar with that work. I know that the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance recently entered into an MOU with NIPA to sort of work on that. They have a group called the Peak Coalition, and they're really working to make sure that those reductions do happen in disadvantaged communities. So the hope, I think, would be, yes, if they work on that and focus on that, that it will have positive impacts.
Okay, great. And here's a question for Mike. Can you talk a little bit about the secondary benefits or the costs that stem from the energy transition, such as the energy efficiency measures that you were recommending, even simple things like lighting and comfort measures? So the secondary benefits or the costs, either of those, of the energy efficiency measures.
Okay, yeah, sure. I could talk about that. Yeah, comfort is actually a big one. And I can tell you something anecdotal. My parents, in fact, they got a building retrofit through a program that it doesn't exist in New York, but it exists in Chicago. If you live in a certain neighborhood and have a certain income level, you can get a free retrofit to your house. A building retrofit is usually around, it could be between like $1,000 to $5,000 depending on where you live, which is a lot of money. I mean, it's not a huge amount of money, but it's a lot of money. But for some people that were able to get in that program and they got that, my parents have told me that it used to get really hot in the summer, and it doesn't so much. It's a lot like it would get like over 80 degrees in the house. Now it gets maybe 75. And in the winter, there's a really big difference because what you're doing if you're in a single family home, for instance, and you do it correctly, you're basically, if you have an attic, you basically seal the attic from the rest of the house. So air that would just be the heat that you're paying for would just go flying out of your attic. That's literally what would happen if you look at a blower door test and you look at the infrared camera, you'll just see like the top of the house will be a lot of, like if you just go through a house, through a neighborhood in the winter with an infrared gun and look at the top of houses, you'll see like all these red houses. And that just means heat is leaving the top of that house and flying out. But if you have insulation and air sealing and you make that house more energy efficient, then you'll start to see the tops of the houses are blue, which means that the warm air is being kept inside the house and you're more comfortable. Also, you're not spending as much money on your heat because you don't need to. So sometimes even if you make a home more efficient, you can get a smaller boiler or furnace because you don't need all the capacity that other one had before. And that will save you money in the long run because a boiler furnace that lasts for like 30 years or so. So energy efficiency can actually make your home way more comfortable and also save you a lot of money in the long run on your bills.
Right. And many of our members are in the business of energy efficiency. So thank you for those comments. Phyllis, I want to give you a chance to do one more.
Okay. Let's see. I'm going to ask this question to Mike. And it's, you talked quite a bit about short-term solutions that have been recommended, but I'm wondering whether you can talk a little bit about more of the longer-term solutions that can deal with urban heat in cities like New York City.
Oh, sure. So some of the ones I mentioned were more medium and long terms. Like some of them are literally changing building codes to allow, for instance, like the maximum indoor temperature. That would be a more long-term thing. Like it doesn't sound like it's that much, but if you make a regulation around that, and I know some people don't like the word regulation, but if you can make regulations that deal with what you can do in a house and what's allowed in a home, I think that's more of a long-term solution as well. I'm trying to think of because we have so many, and I actually wrote an op-ed in City Limits about that I could share with you all about some of the more long-term solutions. I think basically just looking at our building codes and re-examining them for heat and not just looking at it in terms of cold, because in many cities in temperate climates, we only think of cold. So we're like, we have to deal with the cold. And I know where I'm from, a lot of houses still have those coal chutes on the side of the house because you would just shovel coal into the house, and that's how you dealt with the house being cold. So I think making it easier to do energy efficiency in buildings, I think, is a medium and long-term solution. That's also a good economic driver because people will be able, you'll have jobs. Like I remember from the debate, there was a comment like, these homes need to be made energy efficient. But I was like, people have to make the homes energy efficient. They aren't just going to happen. It's not just going to happen. A house isn't just going to make itself energy efficient. So I think there's a secondary effect here where you're doing this energy efficiency work in buildings. And most of the buildings that we have in New York, by 2050, I think, 90% of them are by the next 100 years, 80 to 90% of those buildings are still going to be here. So we have to lower our GHG output. And one of the best ways to do that is through efficiency. So creating efficiency programs for those buildings will make it safer. It'll make it safer for people in the winter and the summer. And it will also provide a huge economic boost in terms of jobs for retrofitting all those buildings.
Thank you, Mike. I know we're at 4 o'clock. I'm going to ask one more question that came in from Rebecca, and I'll read that. Raya mentioned that under the CLCPA, 40% of the state spending to combat the climate crisis would be spent in disadvantaged communities. Would this be primarily mitigation measures like we're talking about with energy efficiency, or would it focus on reducing the greenhouse gas emissions from energy production? Is there any discussion of what the balance of that 35 to 40% is going to be focused on?
I am very glad that you asked that question, because the law itself is very, very broad, and it says all spending on these efforts, and it gives a good laundry list. And so I think the question that you ask is important, because, and there are different ways to think about it. And as we think about, so that would mean it'd be if the state wanted to spend X on adaptation, it would need to make sure that a significant amount of that was focused on disadvantaged communities. So there is, and that can sort of impact the way one would plan or think about that spending. So I think that's a very important question. And it's sort of one of the, the law is simple and specific, in the way it just describes that all of this, it really tries to be all encompassing.
Mhm.
So there's, I think to answer, yes, there are ways to think about that, but the law itself is an umbrella. It gives an umbrella way of looking at it.
Thank you. And while being a member of New York State government, I work for NYSERDA. Paralysis by analysis is a phrase that comes to mind. Sometimes studying things before you do them can seem frustrating, especially to community members who have needs in that moment. But one thing that the CLCPA is doing, as you were mentioning earlier, is really getting input from the communities through each of these different committees and working groups. So I think we're on the right track there. At this point, I want to wrap us up, to remind people and to thank our two speakers. Wonderful job today. Really appreciate all of your time that it took to put these presentations together, and for joining us here at the Association of Energy Engineers. Reminding you all of the November meeting, which